Shalom and welcome to Temple Talk. This is Yitzchak Reuven here in Jerusalem, Israel. Today is the 29th day of the month of Sivan, 5779. It's 2nd of July, 2019. This coming Shabbat, we'll be reading Parashat Chukat. I believe it's the 6th Parashat in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar. Begins chapter 19, verse 1, concludes with chapter 22, verse 1. I'm alone in the studio once again, I think for the third and final time, as next week, God willing, Rabbi Richman will be back with me and retaking the reins. Tonight is the first night, the first day of a 2-day Rosh Chodesh celebration, new month, new moon celebration, bringing in the new month of Tammuz. Actually, tonight is the 30th day of the current month of Sivan, and Wednesday night, Thursday, is the first day of the month of Tammuz. But it's a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, beginning tonight, concluding Thursday evening. Lots of exciting things happening here in Israel. This week, the Pilgrim's Road was opened, officially opened, a grand opening, which included America's ambassador, David Friedman, who very controversially, some people say, symbolically broke a, plasterboard wall with a sledgehammer, inaugurating the new Pilgrim's Road. We'll be talking about that in just a little while. But let's begin with Parashat Chukat. Parashat Chukat, which is, as everyone knows, is the parsha in which the laws of the Red Heifer are enumerated. The parsha begins, like I said, in the book of Numbers, chapter 19, verse 1. Hashem spoke to Moshe and to Aharon, saying, "This is the decree of the Torah which Hashem has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and they shall take to you a completely red cow, which is without blemish, and upon which a yoke has not come. You shall give it to Elazar the Kohen, he shall take it out to the outside of the camp, and someone shall slaughter it in his presence. Elazar the Kohen shall take some of its blood with his forefinger, and sprinkle some of the blood in the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. Someone shall burn the cow before his eyes, its hide and its flesh and its blood, with its dung shall he burn. The Kohen shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson thread, and he shall throw them into the burning of the cow." Okay. Actually, the details concerning the decree, chok in Hebrew, that's why I get the name Chukat from chok, which is a decree or an ordinance. The details continue until verse 22 of this chapter 19, and all about how the ashes of the red heifer are to be prepared and how they are to be applied, and what do these ashes of the red heifer achieve. They achieve, let's call it biblical purity, Torah in Hebrew, the purity which is mitaken, which rectifies the impurity which one gains when one comes in contact with a corpse, with a grave, with a as it describes here, even with a bone of a body, contact with death. When one comes within physical contact of death, even if one is sitting in a tent, as was described here in our parsha, but of course today in the house, in which a corpse also is present, that person incurs the tum'ah, incurs the impurity of death, and the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer, come to rectify that and to purify the person who had come in contact with a corpse. Now, why is the Torah teaching us this now? it's not necessarily teaching us this. Now, as we know, there is no mukdam u'muchar in the Torah. There's no chronological order of how things are presented. And way back when Israel first left Egypt, and they before they crossed the Sea of Reeds, they were told that they were taught an ordinance. They were taught about Shabbat, and they were taught an ordinance. And that ordinance, the chok, our tradition tells us, was actually this, the chok of the red heifer, para aduman in Hebrew, meaning that, according to our sages, these precepts concerning the red heifer actually were first taught to Israel when she first left Egypt, which is very interesting. Why those precepts were taught even before Mount Sinai. But in any case, the ashes of the red heifer are a very, very, very essential part of Torah, and they are very, very essential and necessary part of living a full Torah life here in the land of Israel. And of course, its main relevance, or its most prominent relevance, has to do with the Holy Temple, because to enter into the inner courtyards, and certainly into the sanctuary, which of course is into the sanctuary, only priests, only Kohanim enter, but even into the inner courtyards, one needs to be tahor from tamei meid. One needs to be purified from the impurification of contact with death. So, understandably, the red heifer has been a major concern of the Temple Institute, as it is a major concern of anyone who is hoping and working toward rebuilding the Holy Temple and renewing the service in the Holy Temple, because in order to do so, we need to be able to enter into these courtyards, and the Kohanim, the priests, need to be able to enter into the sanctuary itself. And for that, we need the ashes of the paraduma, the ashes of the red heifer. So, as I said, it's been a major concern, one could almost say an obsession, of the Temple Institute, and over the years we have researched every detail, every aspect of the precepts, of the laws applying the halacha, applying to the red heifer. And we have, at various times throughout our history as a Temple Institute, Temple Institute's been around now for over 30 years, we have begun programs in order to start to breed a red heifer, and most recently is our Raise a Red Heifer in the Land of Israel program, which we began 4 years ago maybe, and we are now currently breeding red heifers here in Israel. And at the moment of my speaking to you, we have 2 or 3 candidates for red heifer. What do I mean by candidate? I mean, what are the qualifications? What are the basic qualifications? Well, we just read them in Numbers 19. That is completely red cow. What does it mean by completely red cow? Well, it means all its hairs must be red. If it sprouts a hair that's not red, then it will be invalid. Actually, if it sprouts 2 hairs that are not red, it will be invalid. Also, the flesh around its nose, any exposed flesh like that must also be of a reddish hue, as well as his hoofs must have a bit of a red tinge to them. Besides that, it must have no blemishes. It can't have any scars. So it must be guarded and looked over very carefully, and it must its pen must be very safe and not have anything that could possibly cause it injury. And thirdly, it must never bear a yoke, meaning it must never be put to work for any type of agricultural purpose or for any purpose whatsoever. So, must have red hairs completely, and no scars, no blemishes, and never having done any kind of labor. So as I say, we have candidates, meaning that currently these young heifers, one was born a year ago approximately, and a couple more were born in the spring a few months ago. And currently they have red hairs, completely red, and currently they have no blemishes. And the real concern, because we can protect them, and barring a fluke accident, they won't be getting any injuries which would cause any type of blemish or scarring. And we certainly have no intention of putting a yoke on them. So the real concern that we look out for are the red hairs, and of course the red patches of flesh. And the heifer must reach the age of 3 years before it is ready to be slaughtered and its flesh burned and prepared with the hyssop and with the cedar and even with the scarlet wool, in order to make the and with pure waters, in order to make the mixture, which is the mixture of the ashes inside the pure waters, so they can be sprinkled upon pilgrims that want to go to the Holy Temple, and rendering them pure and able to enter into the inner courtyards of the Holy Temple. So we don't have a 3-year-old red heifer yet. We have a red heifer, like I said, that's a year old, and a few more that are a few months old. So it's a waiting game right now. But we're determined to produce this red heifer because, like other elements, it's an essential aspect necessary for the renewal of the avodah, the temple service. And just as the Temple Institute has recreated the sacred vessels needed, required of the temple service, of course the menorah, and of course the table of the showbread, and of course the golden altar of the incense, and all of the various shovels and pitchforks and measuring devices and vessels for holding the blood to be poured onto the altar, etc., we have recreated. And so the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer, is the challenge that lays before us. Now, what is a chok? What is a what's the word in English? What is I say. What's the word in English for a chok? What is the I just can't think of the word. I said it earlier. Ordinance. What is the ordinance? What is a Torah ordinance? An ordinance is a commandment that Hashem gives us, that is a commandment. Let's say it's on Hashem's terms, or it's in Hashem's terms. Doesn't have to be really logically understood by us. And it's a commandment that concerns our relationship with Hashem. For example, there are other commandments that could be referred to as mishpatim, don't murder, don't steal. We understand that as societal prerequisites. We can't live in society without obeying these types of commandments. But a chok, for example, kashrut, what we're allowed to eat and not allowed to eat, it's not based on science. It's not based on logic, even though many studies have been made concerning kashrut and concerning what we eat and don't eat. And many of these studies say, well, it's very healthy, it's very good for you. And this may be true. I'm sure it's true. I don't think that God would prescribe something that's not healthy. But that's not the reason for doing it. The reason for doing it is because Hashem said to do it, and there's no necessity to understand fully just why. And when it comes to chukot, when it comes to ordinances, the red heifer is always held up as the ordinance par excellence in its obscureness, let's say, its difficulty to fully comprehend. And one of the enigmas is that the Kohanim, the priests who are involved in preparing and applying, sprinkling the ashes of the red heifer, while that action renders the person receiving it pure, it also renders the Kohen who is performing the purification impure. What's the reason? It's a mystery. And they say that only Moshe fully understood what it was all about. And I like to understand that Moshe's comprehension was based on his unparalleled modesty. We understand that he was the most modest, humble person on earth. Torah tells us that. And it was that modesty, that lack of any ego, that lack of any putting himself before this commandment. What is it? What is it to me kind of attitude. His lack of any ego, his lack of that just allowed him to fully take in and understand the inner meanings of this commandment. But certainly we all understand today why it is so important that we can revive the commandment of the red heifer and be able to utilize those ashes once again in our day. God willing, we'll soon be rebuilding the Holy Temple and renewing the temple service. Immediately after these 19 verses which deal with the red heifer in this week's Parashat, Chukat, we are told of the death of Miriam. Miriam died in Midbar Tzin, in the wilderness of Tzin. And while we are talking about Miriam, let's remember that Miriam was the one who watched over Moshe when he was put in a little ark made of reeds and put on the Nile River so that the Pharaoh's people the Egyptians wouldn't drown him, as Pharaoh had commanded. And she watched over her little brother to make sure he was safe. And of course, when Pharaoh's daughter came and saw Moshe in his little ark of reeds, and she took him out, that Miriam approached her and said, I will find the Hebrew who can nurse this child. And of course she brought her own mother to be Moshe's nurse for the first months of his life. So Miriam was, she's responsible for Moshe. In fact, Midrash tells us that Miriam brought her parents back together after they had gotten a divorce. They said, listen, there's a decree that all our babies will be thrown into the river and murdered, and we can't be part of that. So their solution was to separate. But she convinced them not to do so, because that would not be avoiding or preventing the decree of Pharaoh from taking place, but actually it would be, in a way, complicit with it. So she convinced them to reunite, and as I say, she was the one who watched out for Moshe in his first months when he was put out on the Nile. And of course, Miriam is also famous for leading the reprise of the song of a song of the sea after Israel crossed the Sea of Reeds. The entire nation broke out in song, and when they concluded, it was Miriam and the women who took up their timbrels and sang the song again. And in case you're wondering why they had timbrels when everybody was, running out of Egypt and they hardly had time to pack their things and to bake their bread, how did she think to bring out timbrels? Because she knew. Miriam knew that they were going to leave Egypt. She had total faith in Hashem, and she knew from the start that Hashem was going to redeem Israel, and so she was fully prepared. So, the only blemish that we ever hear about Miriam, of course, is the story of her and Aharon, and they spoke some unflattering words concerning Moshe, which greatly upset Hashem. But other than that, Miriam is a true hero of the people of Israel. And she dies in this week's Parashat. We'll be right back. Temple Talk. Shalom and welcome back to Temple Talk. This is still Yitzchak Reuven here in Jerusalem. Today is still the 29th day of the month of Sivan, 5779, 2nd of July 2019, and we are still talking about Parashat Chukat, which is in the book of Numbers 19:1 to 22:1. And tonight is again the first day of the 2-day Rosh Chodesh celebration of the new month of Tammuz, tonight being the 30th and final day of the current month of Sivan, and tonight, Wednesday night, begins the first day of the new month of Tammuz, and we'll talk about Tammuz more next week when Rabbi Richman is back in the studio. And we've been talking about Parashat Chukat, the Ordinance of the Red Heifer, which is immediately followed by the death of Miriam, which is immediately followed by the debacle. The people, again, are thirsty. It seems like a recurring theme. No water, and the people complain. You think after all these years they know that God's going to make sure that they don't run dry, but they complain. They complain, and Moshe and Aharon went from the presence of the congregation. I'm reading now chapter 20, verse 6. To see to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and fell on their faces. The glory of Hashem appeared to them. And Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, take the staff and gather together the assembly, you and Aharon your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it shall give its waters. Ye shall bring forth for them water from the rock, and give drink to the assembly and to their animals. But, of course, as we know, Moshe doesn't speak to the rock, but he strikes it twice with his staff, and then the water comes out. But God is furious. He says, you didn't sanctify me in front of the congregation because you didn't do as I said. So therefore, you and Aaron both will not enter into the land. Wow. I'm no expert. What do I know? But it seems so harsh to me after all that they've been through, after all that Moshe's been through, after all that he's done for his people, a faithful servant of Hashem, that slip up here and he's out. But first of all, just like that ordinance of the Red Heifer, it's not for me to determine why, or if it's right or not. In my eyes, that's unimportant. But it does tell us that up to this point, apparently, Moshe followed every instruction, every commandment of Hashem precisely, and never deviated from what he was told to do. This is a first, and therefore it is a precedent, and there is something very serious about this. And in fact, not only did he strike the rock twice instead of speaking to it, but it says in verse 10, Moshe and Aharon gathered the congregation before the rock, and he said to them, Moshe said to the people, listen now, O rebels, shall we bring forth water for you from this rock? Why is he calling them rebels? What brought that on? The people are thirsty. Yeah. They have tried Moshe. They've tried Hashem. They've tried Moshe many times, and Moshe more than once has gone to Hashem and say, please take this burden from off of me. Who am I that I can't handle these people? But Moshe never castigated the people as such. Rebels. I mean, he has scolded the people when they've done serious wrong. But, crying out and even saying foolish things maybe because you're thirsty. You're thirsty. The people are thirsty. So it's perhaps Moshe's words calling the people rebels and his hitting the rock were signifying that his time was up. He was growing old as a leader. His patience and it was growing a bit threadbare. I'm sort of tiptoeing because God forbid, don't want to say anything harsh about Moshe. But these might be some of the reasons why God saw this as reason enough that Moshe will not enter into the land with the people. Moshe and Aaron. And of course, Aaron, we have other questions. Aaron, who was involved in the sin of the golden calf, and wasn't told that he's not going to the land because of that, and now he also is included in this punishment. But such is the will of God. Far from us to question it. Of course, we can try to understand it and try to wrap our brains around it, but that's the way it is. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, when we hear Moshe's first-hand account of many of these things, he attributes his not being allowed into the land to the sin of the spies. And of course, at the sin of the spies, God said only Kalev and only Yoshua will enter. So actually, one could learn from there that's when Moshe, that's when it became clear to Moshe that he wasn't going in. But in any case, Moshe's not going in. But despite the fact that he had this one-time momentary slip-up immediately after this incident. We're told that Moshe sent messengers to Edom. Edom, the nation of Edom, was living in the area that was right now effectively between where Israel was, where the children of Israel were, where the land of Israel was, and Israel had to go through Edom to get there. So Moshe sent messengers, and they said, we're going to allow us to walk through. We're not going to turn to the left or the right. We're not going to drink your waters. We're not going to take your fruit. We're not going to enter your fields. We just want to get to the other side. And of course, Edom said, no, you can't come in. And Israel turned away and made a big detour. And the reason Israel turned away and made a big detour and did not go to war against Edom, as she will do in a moment against Arad, is because Edom, of course, is a nation that nation of Esav, the brother of Yaakov, and Israel will not go to war against Esav's descendants, because it's family. So they turn, and then they head toward, they make a big detour, and then on the way on this detour, they arrive at Mount Hor, and at Mount Hor, God says to Moshe, "This is the final place for Aaron, your brother, and you and Aaron's son Eleazar will both climb up to the top of Mount Hor in front of the entire assembly of Israel, who will be watching. And Eleazar, Aaron, his clothes, his bigdei kuhuna, his garments of the high priest, are removed from him and put on Eleazar." Very, very, very poignant scene in my mind's eye of this passing of the generation, changing of the guard, and of course the demise of Aaron, who dies in front of the entire congregation. Aaron, the high priest who represented Israel before Hashem in the holy temple, in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, where he would take up the burden of Israel, the sins that Israel had accrued over the year, and ask for God's forgiveness on their behalf. Aaron, who, according to Midrash, was a man of peace, a man who loved every soul in Israel, who, when he heard of marital strife, he would engage each of the couple, the husband and wife individually, in order to help them to work out their differences and bring them back together. In fact, he was so successful as a marriage counselor that in the generation that was born in the desert, many of those young boys who were born bore the name Aaron, sort of a gesture of thanks to Aaron, who brought the couple back together. And Aaron was perhaps the most beloved leader of Israel. You know, it says here that the people mourned for Aaron 30 days, and when Moshe dies at the close of the book of Deuteronomy, it says they mourned for Moshe, but it doesn't say for 30 days. So, Aaron has now passed away. Eleazar is the new Kohen Gadol, and the new generation is growing up and assuming its position. And I would believe that the war is being waged now by Israel. As Israel makes its way now, there's nothing to prevent Israel from entering the land other than the nations that stand between Israel and the land, because apparently at this time, the passage of time, those 39 years that Israel was condemned to wander in the desert because of the sin of the spies, are coming to a close. All that time has elapsed here during the book of Numbers. And when you think about it that way, 39 years, and we read in the book of Numbers about a couple of breakdowns. We learn about Korach, we learn about the spies, we learn about them complaining about this and complaining about that, and a few disasters like this. Over 40 years, that's a pretty good record, Not bad. 40 years and just a handful of national breakdowns and disasters. When you think about our lives today, and you read the news and all the ups and downs that we experience, if these were the only downs that Israel experienced during all that time, and certainly they were the only downs that were worth recording because they had any real significance for all the generations, then it really was a pretty remarkable generation. But now, as the older generation is dying out, and of course every last one of the males were to die, save for Caleb and Yoshua of that generation before the younger generation could enter into the land. That's where we're at right now in the book of Numbers. And I said every male because, again, the Midrash has it that the women were not taken in by the false report, the dibah, the evil report of the spies, but they remained loyal always to the land of Israel, just as the women were not suckered into the debacle of the golden calf and did not lend not their ears, but their earrings and their jewelry, gold jewelry, toward the making of the golden calf. So, in fact, it is said that when Israel entered into the land of Canaan, later to be Israel, that there was a surplus, as it were, of elderly women, because the men of that generation had all died out, but the women were still going strong. So, next in the Parashat is, again, Israel needs to cross over the land of the Canaanite king of Arad, who will not allow it, and he sends his army out to meet Israel, and Israel conquers the people of Arad, and right after that, once again, what happens? No food, no water. And again, as we read in chapter 21, verse 5, the people spoke against God and Moshe, "Why did you bring us up from Egypt to die in this wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul is disgusted with the insubstantial food." I'm always curious who is complaining here. Is it the remnants of the older generation, or is it the younger generation? The younger generation was born in the desert, and I imagine that they know how to make their way in the desert. That's been their whole life. It seems to me less likely that they would be complaining, especially when they are so determined to enter into the land. But again, there's not so many people left in that older generation. I don't have an answer to that question. But of course, that leads to the fiery serpents that God sends against the people for their shortness of spirit and their words against God and Moshe. And these fiery serpents are biting the people, and they're dying. So the people run to Moshe and they say, "We're sorry. Please pray. Pray to Hashem that remove from us the serpent." And Moshe prayed, and God told Moshe to make this copper or bronze serpent and mount it on a staff and hold it up, and anybody who had been bitten by a serpent would look at this and be cured, and to stop the plague of the serpents. Again, it's a very curious, very interesting thing going on here. What is the power of this bronze serpent that Moshe was instructed to devise? And did it have its own power? When the people looked at it, were they was it raised up toward the heavens? So when the people were looking at it, they were also facing toward the heavens, and their intention was with God. It's not clear. It is clear, however, that later on in history it was kept, and it was later on in history it sort of became a cult around it, and the people were instructed to melt it down. I think we read about that in, I think, the Book of Kings. I'm sorry, I didn't look up that before the show, and I'm not 100% sure, but it is definitely described the ultimate melting down of this bronze serpent, and so on and so forth. And then here's a beautiful thing that the rabbi, I believe, is going to be talking about in greater length in this week's video Parashat teaching, that next time the people are thirsty, they actually dig a well. You know what? They're thirsty. They don't complain. They dig a well. Guess what? Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, is growing up, and they're becoming independent, and they're learning to do things on their own. And this is also very significant because, going back to Miriam, we know that Miriam was always responsible for the well of Miriam that followed Israel throughout the wilderness. Everywhere where Israel encamped, this well, this spring, would travel with Israel, just like the clouds of glory traveled with Israel, and they are on account of the merit of Aharon and the well, the waters of Miriam. That was on account of the merit of Miriam. And when she died, immediately after she died, of course, there was no water, and that's when Moshe hit the rock. So her absence is very strongly felt. But here the people realize that every time there's no water, you can't just complain to Moshe, and you can't just complain to God. And in fact, that's the first sign. That plus waging wars. I guess that's the first sign. But waging wars and digging their own well are the first signs that this people are really ready now to enter into the land of Israel and to fully assume their independence and the responsibility of creating a nation in Israel that is based on Torah, at whose center is the Holy Temple, the Mikdash, in which the Shekhinah, the presence of God, will dwell and emanate throughout the land. So, the final verse of this week's Parashat Chukat is chapter 22, verse 1. The children of Israel journeyed and encamped in the plains of Moab, on the banks of the Jordan opposite Jericho. So here, by the time we conclude this week's Parsha, Israel is a heartbeat outside the land of Israel. It's just a 5-minute walk from entering the land. And of course, this is where Israel is going to be throughout the rest of the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy, because the book of Deuteronomy, of course, covers the final 37 days of Moshe, in which he speaks, unburdens his heart to the people, the children of Israel, and speaks for 37 days. The final day of which he dies, and immediately after, in the book of Joshua leads the nation into the land of Israel. So this week in the Parashat Chukat, we actually arrive with the nation of Israel on the banks of the Jordan River. You know what? It's maybe 40 minutes drive from where I am right now in the center of Jerusalem, and from where I live, it is, I think, under 20-minute drive to get to the precise spot, really, where they were encamped. There were times in this book of Numbers where I wasn't so sure Israel was ever going to make it, but right now they are ready to enter the land, and that is very good news. Very happy to see that. All is good, but of course there is one last obstacle, and we'll be reading about that next week in Parashat Balak. I'm hearing music. I guess that means my time's up. So, thanks for being with me. Next week, again, Rabbi Richman will be back. And together with all of us here in the studio, thanks for being with me. Temple Talk.